Shevuot Daf Yomi Matmonim, avoiding OCD in Halacha, שבילין. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is very common from people. Particularly people who are yorech, people who are afraid of doing something wrong or understand the seriousness of doing wrong, can become quite obsessive about concerns, and particularly in the area of sfekot, where you're not sure. Did I do it? Didn't I do it? Did I make a bracha? Didn't I make a bracha? Is this right? Isn't it right? Are there bugs on my letters? Aren't there bugs? Well, you know for sure you don't get obsessive compulsive. You know what the halacha is, but when things are unclear, when there are sfekot, there is a tendency to become obsessive because the stakes are high and the consequences are serious. And yet the halacha builds in mechanisms to deal with the avoiding OCD, and we've talked about it several times, and here we'll get more deeply into one of those mechanisms in dealing with sfekot. So what is a safek? Firstly, we know the halacha, we've been dealing with this. We now get to the end of the second parak of Shevuot, and the end of those almost 20 daf that deal with tumah and tara, purity and impurity, that we've been engrossed in for these few weeks. In this last piece, we deal with the din that we've been dealing with all the way through, that if a person has had physical contact with something or someone who is tameh, who is spiritually impure, they can't come into the Beis Hamikdash and they can't eat kodshim, they can't eat food which is kodesh for the mizbeach, for the Beis Hamikdash. What about if somebody is not sure whether he is tameh or not? He's a sofek tameh. So now we have two kinds of sfekot when it comes to tameh and tara. We have a principle that we use in Hilchot Shabbat a lot. In Shabbat, we know that the concepts of Reshut HaYachid and Reshut HaRabim are very prominent. Private domains and public domains have different halachot as far as, for example, carrying on Shabbat is concerned. And the same applies in Sofek Tumah. There is a difference in private domain and a public domain. A private domain, Sofek Tumah, is Tomeh, and in a public domain, Sofek Tumah is Tahor. In private, if you're in doubt as to whether something is tameh or it is tahor, you take the more severe view. You assume that it's tameh. If it's in public property, you assume that it's tahor. So here we have an example of this. Tanu Rabbanan, Shnei Shevilin, Echad Tameh ve'Echad Tahor. Famous piece of Gemara. We've got it in Kritus as well. We'll see it there soon. And we learn many things from this piece of Gemara. There are two paths in front of a person. One path is tameh, one is tahor. That means for example, there's a dead body that's buried across the one path. If he walks down that one path, he's definitely going to become tameh. If he walks down the other path, there's no fear of tumah. But he doesn't know which is which. V'halach barishon v'lo nichnas, and he walked down the one path, and he didn't go to the Beis Hamikdash. A few days later, he goes down the second path, and then he goes into the Beis Hamikdash. Then chayav, then you're chayav. Why? Says Rashi, or machmat biyah rishona, or machmat biyah shniya, deman nafshach, or biyah rishona, or biyah shniya, betumah heta. Rashi says, the comment is on the next piece, but it applies here as well, because of miman nafshach. Either way, you're chayav. The fact is, you walk down both paths. When you walk down path A, you weren't sure. When you walk down path B, you weren't sure. But having walked down path A and B, you are sure. Mishnah gives us a slightly different case. Halach barishon v'nichnas. He walked down the first path and he went into the Beis Hamikdash. And because he was worried and concerned about it, he zav v'shana v'taval. He went through the whole Parah Aduma process. And he gets purified through the waters of the Parah Aduma, so now he's tahor again. V'achar kach halach bashini v'nichnas. And then he walks down the second path and he goes in. There the Tanna Kama also says chayiv, Rabbi Shimon says poter. The Tanna Kama says Yuchayv. Why? As Rashi explains, there again, no matter what, you've been down both paths. And yes, when you went down the first path, maybe you were, maybe you weren't, but having been down both paths, you know that you've been into the Beis Hamikdash in a way that you are tameh, you are impure. And Rabbi Shimon says no, because the fact is you've got to look at each path separately, and on each path there was doubt. Tosfos adds an important point and says, we're clearly talking here about Reshus HaRabim. Because if it was Reshus HaYachid, it's Sfekot Tameh. Then we've got to treat it as Tameh, even the first path. Even if you only went down one path, you considered Tameh. But maybe this is the path that's Tahor, but maybe this is the path that's Tameh. So you're in doubt. If you're in doubt, Sofek Tumah Bereshus HaYachid, if you are in private domain and you're in doubt about your Tumah, you've got to treat it as if you're Tameh. So clearly we're not talking about that. Aval hacha ayri Bereshut HaRabim. very important words in Tosfos. Here we're talking about Reshus Harabim, where we regard him with the assumption of Tahara. That's what Bechezkas Tahara means, as you see why we translate it that way. So we regard him as assuming to be Tahor. And that's why if you work down the one path, we assume you're Tahor. Are you Tahor for sure? We don't know. But Safek Tumah B'Reshut Harabim Tahor, we're told by the Torah that if you're in public domain, you may assume that you are Tahor, that you're pure. You walk down the second path. Now what? Now you've got a situation of Mimon of Shach. The fact is, no matter what, you're definitely Tameh in this case. There's a piece of Shev Shmaitzer at the very beginning. The Shev Shmaitzer, you remember, is written by the Ktsois HaChoshen. It's a magnificent sefer dealing in detail and enormous depth with the whole area of Sveikot, of doubt, which is, we've often said, is the fundamental of Halacha. Because what Halacha is really here to teach us, a large part of Halacha, is not just what is right and what is wrong when you know. It's how to act when you don't know, when you're not sure. And I've often defined halachic reasoning as the methodology of living with certainty in an environment of uncertainty, which is most of our lives. How to operate with certainty even though the facts are never clear or never certain. That's what halacha treats us. And the Shev Shmaitzer goes into it. The Shev Shmaitzer, he wrote 7 Shmaitzes, 7 essays on this topic, and it was his Sheva Brocha Torah. He gave these, each night he gave one of these Shmaitzes at his Sheva Brochas. He was a very young man when he wrote them. And then he worked on the Sefer again before he published it when he was older, and then he published it as the Shev Shmaitzer. And he brings in the beginning of the Shev Shmaitzer that the Rambam's view is that although that the din is that Sofek D'Oraisa L'Chumra, if you're unsure as to whether you did something wrong and it's a Torah law that you're unsure about, then we go l'chumra, you assume that you've done it wrong and you do the corrective actions. And the Rambam holds that is a law of the rabbis, not a law of the Torah. The law of the Torah is if it's just a sofek, you're not sure. It's not treated as having done anything wrong. The Torah deals with things you're sure about. The Rabbanan, the rabbis, deal with how do you manage situations that you're unsure about. Because in the Torah's worldview, there is certainty. God looks at the world and he knows what's what. We're human beings. We don't always know what's what. So the Rabbanan come and they teach us how to act in situations that we don't know. And therefore, if you have got a sofek, you're not sure what to do in a matter of the Torah, the rabbis say you go l'chumra, you go the more severe route. And the Shev Shmaitzer brings the famous Pri Chodosh, where the Pri Chodosh says, you can't prove in favor of the Rambam against the Rashba, who has the opposite view. V'chein misofek tuma b'rishus harabim disfeiko tahor leka lemedak b'neikis farat harambam. You can't prove, like the Rambam, that midoraisa, from the Torah's perspective, a doubt can be taken the lighter way. Maybe you would want to prove this from the law of disofek tuma b'rishus harabim the the fact that if you have a doubtful contamination in public domain, you may assume it to be tahor, even though we're dealing here with matters of the Torah. This is matters d'oraisa. So you see, according to the Torah, we take the lighter view. It's just the Rabbanan who said, but if you're in Rishus HaYochid, then you've got to take the more heavy view. There are situations where you've got to take the more serious view. But that's not the view of the Torah. You can't prove that from Tumah. It says the Pri Chodosh, why not? The simple way to understand the Pri Chodosh is that he's saying, because in the case of Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, before you became Safek Tameh, before you encountered this Tameh object or person or dead body, before you encountered that, you were Tahor. So we know for sure you were Tahor. Now we're in doubt as to whether you became Tameh or not, so we use the Chazokah, we leave you as you were. The status quo is what is applied, because we have no certainty that the status quo has changed. And that's a principle of Chazokah throughout Torah, that when you have a doubt, but you have a strong status quo, you know that the situation was A. You're in doubt as to whether it's changed to B. You assume it's still A, because of the doubt. Says the Pri Chodosh, that's why Tuma b'rishus harabim is like tahara, that if one is sofek tuma b'rishus harabim is tahor. If you're in doubt about tuma and you're in the public domain, we assume that you're tahor, that you're pure, because you were pure before the doubt arose. So why worry about the doubt? So tuma is different. Asks the Shev Shmaitzer, that doesn't really work, because mevu'ar bekama mekomot b'shas ti b'rishus harabim sveika tahor af agav deleka chazkas tahara. Because I can bring you many examples in Shas, and he does, where this principle of you may assume that you're still tahor applies even where you did not have a status quo before. Even if before you weren't, there was no certainty that you were tameh. And now there's a new doubt that comes into the question, did this thing make you tameh or not? And you don't come with a chazakah, you don't have a chazakah, we still say that we take the lighter view. Therefore, says the Shev Shmaitzer, this has got nothing to do with chezkes taro vehemidano or chezkato. It has nothing to do with the chezkes taro, but it's exeris hakosov. That you've just got to, the Torah gave us this rule, and that's how we apply the rule. That's how we apply the law. What I would suggest is that in the words of Tosfos, we understand the Pri Chodosh a little differently, or the Pri Chodosh understands the Tosfos a little bit differently from the way that the Ktsos HaChoshen does, the Shev Shmaitzer. Let's understand what is the possible difference. Tosfos' words are, Aval b'hacha ayri b'rishus harabim. Here we're talking about public domain. Demukmino le b'cheskat tahara. Tosfos does not say, Demukminan le b'cheskato v'tahor. There are two meanings to the word chazakah. We use chazakah, there are more than two meanings, but for this purpose, we use the term chazakah in two different words, in two different senses. The one is status quo. We don't change the status quo. We know something was the case. We're not sure if that has changed. So we leave it as it was. We leave it where we know for sure. We don't introduce the doubt. That's one idea of chazakah. Another idea of chazakah is an assumption, where the Torah says you're permitted to make an assumption. And assumptions, we've spoken about this before in previous Masechtas, how important the concept of assumptions is in Halacha. That you can't live without assumptions. You can't operate without assumptions. If you don't make assumptions, you're depending on certainty, and we don't have certainty. So you're eating this piece of lettuce and you're not sure if there's a bug on it. And if you check the lettuce, are you sure? And if you use a magnifying glass, maybe you'll see something you didn't see with your eye. And if you use a stronger magnifying glass, maybe you'll see something you didn't see with a weaker magnifying glass. And if you use a microscope, maybe you'll see something that you couldn't even see with a... At what point do you relax and say, I can eat this piece of lettuce? So you can't do it on the basis of, I can eat it because I know for sure there are no bugs on it. Nobody knows for sure that there are no bugs on any piece of lettuce they eat. The question is, am I entitled to assume? I've taken the necessary precautions. Am I entitled to assume that this is kosher or not? And that's the case in all sorts of areas in Halacha. Halacha is about what you may assume and when you may assume it, and what you have to do in order to assume it, and when you cannot assume it. Even when two witnesses come and give us evidence, do we know for sure that that's what happened? Is there any possibility that the witnesses are lying? Of course there's a possibility. We don't know for sure. The Torah tells us if we have two witnesses and we check the witnesses properly, we're entitled to assume. Not entitled, we have to assume that that's what occurred. We've got to act on the assumption. We act on assumptions. We don't act on facts. It's just too rare that we know enough about the facts to be able to act. When somebody says something, when somebody does something, do you really know what they mean? Do you really know what they intend? No, you make assumptions. And the beauty about assumptions is you can choose your own assumptions. You can't choose your own facts. The fact is somebody said something nasty about you. That's a fact. But you can assume that he had a bad day, that he doesn't really mean it. You can make that assumption if you want, and then you can have a good day. Or you can make the assumption that he's got something against you and spend your whole day wondering what it is that he's got against you. It's your choice. Our bechira is an assumptions. Our bechira, our choice, is not in fact, is not in reality. You can't choose reality. But you can choose the assumptions you want to make about the realities with which you're confronted. And that's what Tosfos means here. It's not that we're giving him a prior chazaka of a status quo. The Torah, this is the Gzeras HaKosov piece. This is what the Torah tells us, or the Rabbanan tell us, however you want to learn it, like the Rambam or the Rashba. This is what we're told. You are expected to make an assumption, and the assumption is one of tahara. If it's in public domain, the expectation is it's purity. And I found a magnificent piece. What a gem. This was in a magazine printed in 1951 with various different essays that they found of various Gedolei Yisrael, of various Rosh Yeshivas from the previous generation. And one of them is a piece of Rabbi Chonon Wasserman on this Shev Shmaitzer. And that's why I've photostat it for you in this way so that you can see how it's printed. It's literally just in a paperback. And he goes through this and he brings a proof because he's going into the whole question of when we're told that you, like a suffix, tumah b'reshus harabim is Torah, does it mean it actually makes a Torah? Does it change the reality? Or is it just about an assumption? And he proves from this Gemara that it's just about an assumption. And he brings the Gemara, the Shnei Shvilin, and he brings Ayin Sham B'Tosfos, the b'reshus harabim Mairi, the mukminin le b'cheskes Torah, Ve'i neimad al yedei hachazaka hatamei mithapech liyot tahor. If you want to suggest that this chazaka means we know he was tahor before, so treat him as tahor, assume nothing changed. This person is still tahor. If that's what it means, amai chayev mishum mimanavshach, then how does the mimanavshach work? That when you've walked down both paths, you're definitely tamei. How does that work? Ha'en kan mimanavshach klal, there is no mimanavshach. Why? Because if you say it really changes the reality, he walked down the first path and he went into the Beis HaMikdash. But he was tahor because the suffix tumah b'reshus harabim is tahor. He walked down the second path, he went into the Beis HaMikdash. He's tahor because the suffix tumah b'reshus harabim is tahor. The chazaka does not change the reality. As it is. Hashem knows. He is Torah, he isn't Torah. God knows the truth. We don't know the truth. And this doesn't tell us what the truth is. All the chazaka tells us is you don't have to get OCD. You don't have to get all worried and maybe I'm Tomei and maybe I can't go into the Beis HaMikdash. You can assume. But when there's a mimanavshach, what does the mimanavshach mean? You walk down path A, you walk down path B. So we know for sure that you're Tomei. What does an assumption help? You can't make an assumption when the facts are against it. You can make an assumption when you're not sure. If the person who says something nasty about you says to you, and don't think I'm saying this because I've had a bad day. I'm saying this because you've done me a wrong. I'm saying this because I'm mad at you. That's why. Then you can't make an assumption that he just had a bad day and he doesn't mean it. He's telling you he does mean it. So you can't use an assumption to undermine reality. You can only use an assumption to take a position when reality is unclear. And most of the time our realities are unclear. And that's the power of assumptions. But we also have to be very careful not to allow our assumptions to overrule realities. That's called insanity. That's when people start behaving in an insane way. Says Rabbi Chonon Wasserman, if you've been down both paths, then mimanavshach, either way, the reality is you tamei. You can't use an assumption now. But if you've only been down one path at a time, each one of those is an assumption. And from here he proves that this is the nature of Sofek Tumah B'Reshus HaRabim is not that it changes reality, it's merely an assumption of behavior. And he explains in the same essay that although we'd say normally we don't learn Isur from Tumah, that's talking about a specific type of learning. In this case, the way we operate with doubt, the way we operate with Sveikot, we do learn from Tumah. This is one of the sources of how we manage our anxiety when we're not sure of reality. We manage our anxiety using principles of chazaka, not the chazaka that the Pri Chodesh suggests as the Shev Shmaitzer understands him, which means a chazaka of a previous status quo, not that chazaka. Rather, the chazaka that we explained in the Pri Chodesh in Tosfos, what it means is we are permitted to make an assumption that the chazaka here is a cheskes tahara. The assumption is that the person is tahor, and with that way we can navigate our way through this world of uncertainties, the world in which we live, where we know so little for sure. We've got to understand, yes, I don't know the facts, but I can make assumptions. what's an intelligent assumption to make, and then to progress our lives on the basis of intelligent assumption and not on the basis of obsessing about possible alternatives.